Okay. Now, with that being said, what we need to recognize is that these three phases, a pre-war, a war state, and a post-war state, all also, with respect to peacekeeping, it's important. Professionally, I'm an educator, and specifically, I educate students on conflict and peacemaking, peace-building strategies, various peace-building strategies. And technically speaking, you can't really talk about peace-building strategies properly without understanding, in the grand international scheme, how peace-building and peacemaking strategies factor into a concept of just war theory, right? So it's important to understand that. So for example, if I were to talk about interventionist strategies, right, with respect to a peacemaking or a peacekeeping endeavor that I have, where would I incorporate interventionist strategies in a just war theory, right? And you'll often hear news reporters, I hear it all the time, saying the United States government has intervened on behalf of XYZ, and this country has made interventions, and so on. And typically when they're talking about intervention, they usually use intervention before the war actually is begun, right? Which is technically incorrect. You cannot intervene prior to war, right? You cannot intervene prior to war. So what I'm going to do now is, with respect to the three different states, I'm going to talk about what can be done as far as peace-building strategies in a just war theory. So this will be peace-building strategies in just war theory. Right? So we're going to have three different strategies that peace builders can incorporate in an analysis of just war theory. Why is this important? Well, it's important to understand if you're not currently engaged in battle, if you are not affiliated with the armed services anywhere within the world, and you want to offer some assistance, it's important to understand how that assistance is best used, right, during or prior or after battle, right? The first thing to recognize is that when we're talking about jus ad bellum, right, the justice for going to war, pre-war state, interventionist strategies cannot be implemented in a pre-war state. What happens in the pre-war state is that we implement preventionist strategies. So that in a pre-war state, we can talk about prevention. The example that I use in class when I'm giving a lecture on this is to say the following. Imagine that I was a guidance counselor in a high school. And my job and the sort of role of my employment is to prevent students from, and to educate students about the dangers of using drugs, right? So let's imagine that there's a population of students that have not tried drugs. There's a population of students that are currently using drugs. And there's a population of students that were using drugs but are no longer using drugs. So those are the three states of the population that I deal with as a guidance counselor. The materials that I make would be better suited to affect the student body if I recognize these distinctions, right? Because the information that I send people that aren't currently using drugs is to prevent them from using drugs, right? So it would talk about the problems of peer pressure and the problems that drugs create in an individual's life, and so on and so on. So what I'm doing prior to their use of drugs is I'm attempting to prevent them from actually using drugs in school, right? I'm not intervening, right? You can't intervene because they haven't started using. Similarly, in talking about just war theory, you really can't talk about, and news reporters say this all the time and they're wrong for phrasing it this way, you cannot intervene in a conflict if the conflict hasn't started, right? There's no way to talk about effective peace-building strategies in terms of intervention if the battle hasn't started. The only thing that you can do prior to the battle is to talk about preventionist strategies, right? Preventionist strategies. Strategies that will de-escalate conflict, right? And there's lots and lots of literature, lots and lots of theory on de-escalation, escalation of conflict, battle, so on and so forth. There's tons of literature. But what's important to recognize is that if we're talking specifically now about peace, which is what I do for a living, is to talk about peace. If we're talking about peace and peace building strategies, it's important to understand that when we're talking about a jus ad bellum, we can only talk about preventionist strategies. Okay, now to return to the example of the high school guidance counselor, for those students who are currently on drugs, right? They come to school intoxicated, they're not participating, they've been deluded to think that education isn't important. What I want to do as the guidance counselor is intervene on behalf of those students. I want to help detoxify them, right? Give them information about the local detox clinic. Give them the information on the AA clinic and so on, right? There's different information that I would use, not the same information for those that I'm trying to prevent from using drugs. It'd be a whole new different pamphlet that I would use to intervene on behalf of those who are currently on drugs. Similarly, in just war theory, when the battle's actually going on, right, when we are engaged, right, when this is engagement, right, hence the term rules for engagement. Once we're engaged in battle, you can no longer use prevention strategies because there's nothing to prevent. The battle's already begun, right? So peace builders and peacemakers need to recognize that at this point, we're going to be talking about interventionists. I-N-T-E-R-V-E-N. We're going to be talking about intervention, right? And probably the greatest intervention force out today is probably NATO, right? NATO is an interventionist, or can be used as an interventionist force, right? Sometimes it takes force to prevent further force. And there's a lot of theory that goes around the use of force and violence in battle to bring about peace, right? There's a ton of literature and it gets far more complicated. I'm not going to go off on a tangent and discuss that now. What I want you to recognize is the distinction between preventionist and interventionist strategies with respect to peace building. Okay, and then lastly, when we are talking about jus post bellum, right? When we talk about jus post bellum, the events after the war, justice after war is done. Well, now we're not going to talk about prevention because the war is already over, right? So it doesn't make sense to talk about prevention. We're not going to talk about intervention, again, because the war is over. So what do we talk about with respect to jus post bellum? Well, we're talking in this about assistance, assistance or aid, right? This is where we give aid, this is where we offer assistance, right? So you might have Amnesty International might come and see what was going on in the war and try and figure out the events of the atrocities, right? Because it wasn't safe to do it during the war. You might have private firms that come in and attempt to reconstruct homes or build bridges or set up proper irrigation or clean water. Refugee camps will often be set up during this phase, right?